Hello, welcome to the Aerospace Working Group Annual Update for 2025. I'm Matt Weber, and I co-lead with Dr. Martin Hall. This year was my first year on the working group as the co-lead. I do want to thank Steve Vanderleest for the leadership and the work that he did in the prior few years, from the point of when things started out to defining, some of the themes that you'll see in the upcoming slides. Uh, Background wise, I come from the embedded space. I have about 17 years in embedded development. A lot of it is like real-time Linux within regulated industries. So defense applications, commercial applications that have like the DO 178 standards involved. So um, I'm very interested in seeing success of this group and jumped at the chance. So today our agenda is very similar to the other briefings. We're going to look a little bit at this past year and try to give you an idea of where some of the collaboration opportunities are leaning into 2025 and some links of how to get involved. I did make a QR code for the slide deck, so up in the upper right, at any point through some of the slides, that's there if you want to grab the deck and pull the link up. I also left our vision statement in here at the bottom. I think it's interesting with how the working groups work together, and this has been discussed a few times. And we feed use cases for our industry. There are many industries under aerospace, but for that general safety case to help inform how the architecture, tools, and process comes together. So there's a lot of work where we both use and produce content with the other groups. And I think what's really interesting is I think we originally looked at like design assurance, mostly focused on like say commercial big planes. But this year it's really stretched out where we now see with space grade Linux, you have like the NASA class levels now. So you have class levels, we have assurance or software levels from 178. And even from like military avionics, you'd have something called level of rigor. So we have all these sort of overlapping safety standards that target this aerospace case. And we were able to chip away at that this year. So really interesting. And let's get into 2024. So this past year, I think we had really good membership and actively in the meetings. If you go look at our minutes, you'll see that we had a very diverse set of vendors and companies. We increased the meeting count from 2023 from 18 to 23 meetings, and our attendance also went up almost 2 people. And interesting dynamic with this is we started the year off as the aerospace working group, and then mid-year there was this incubation of the space grade Linux work. So right now we're still working together because there's special interest, but as was just mentioned earlier, the groups are growing, and I think our focus and vision overlaps in areas, but we also have a bunch of opportunity as both groups. So in 2025, I think you'll see that split of there's probably be space grade participation with a vision focus and um, still growing aerospace. So a lot of the working group focus this year was on the use case development of our first case on cabin lighting. This is a case that had to do with more a reliability mindset of where it needed to function within a constraint, but it wasn't like life-threatening type of case. So we drafted an architecture and requirements for it. We looked at how it overlaid on top of the Linux operating system and just the complexity of like what things we depended on. There was a lot of good discussion from that mindset. And then we also looked at, well, how would we go and verify something like that? And that's the point we're at right now, which I'll talk a little bit about in later slides. We're trying to do that verification and test to get a hands-on demo to give this use case a tangible form. So this is one of many. I think with space grade Linux spooling up, I think we'll have cases that apply to space as well as like commercial aerospace, as well as cases that are specific between the two. So yeah, really interesting space. That's a topic thread that we always look for more participation. I think, the more companies and the more perspectives are only going to make these cases better. So we'll continue to work this one add additional this year. Other big item from this past year is the Space Grade Linux Special Interest Group. It started, I think, in discussions in springtime or so. And throughout summer leading up to fall, there was a lot of planning and direction finding and really good input that led to a workshop that I'll let others go into depth on later in the space grade talk. But in December at NASA Goddard, they hosted a workshop that really worked to define um, the focus and the challenges of space. And I do want to thank Ramon and Yvonne for leading this. I know Michael and Scott led off, I think, the charter and incubated it. And yeah, it's really neat to see this come together and what it's going to look to try to achieve here in 25. Related to presentations and outreach, I think the most recent one was the workshop about the forming of the ecospace around space in December. This link would get you to the videos and the content from that event and the schedule. The other really big theme for our working group this year has been coverage. So it started back in May and leads up to work at Plumbers and discussions where modified condition decision coverage was a feature that was worked by the UIUC university here in the US and Boeing. That collaboration has yielded the official LLVM, I think, release. I should have looked at which version specifically. It's in the current stable. So so it's useful for regular application coverage analysis and various test types. So it has this sort of output for the developer, but it also has like statistics on if you ran it overall on your code base, you'll get more than just MCDC coverage. So that was presented at Plumbers. And what's interesting about the source-based talk is it walks through the progression of why coverage and why not gcov, and it shows you the outputs and gives you really good comparison. So if you know the basic technology space, I'd encourage like this source-based code coverage is a good place to start to understand that. The other interesting thing at EOS, similar presentation, but Andrew Uppel from the Boeing company presented on like an intro to DO-178 and worked you up to that code coverage conversation. So this again is another really good one. If you're an embedded developer, you understand some of the basics around testing of non-safety. If you wanted to understand the constraints of DO-178 and work your way to measuring code coverage, Andrew did a really great presentation, and that's a link to the video for that one too. So these efforts were discussed in more detail in Matt Kelly's tools working group discussion yesterday in that video. They do have like a future facing plan to do more than MCDC. Other talk that was discussed in Plumbers and in the workshop at NASA, the safety architecture group went into more detail in their discussion about requirements and design artifacts in the Linux kernel. That's an area you'll see is on our list in 25 of figuring out, well, how do we start tying to some of that the like meta, artifact metadata type content, because that's going to be important for use cases and such. So those talks were conversation was introduced at Plumbers, and then the workshop had a little bit deeper dive. So this year, our current activity we're working on is the verification demos for the cabin lighting use case. Our goal with this is to have a set of pre-built images, a basic example of how it works against the current use case, and then also sort of incubating how would someone take our demo and adjust all the various pieces of it and extend it to apply it to their application. And Martin Hall had a really good feedback item that he's like, I want one of my undergrad or grad students to be able to go to this site, read the README, get an idea of what's being demonstrated, and then extend it in some way and use it as like a learning tool or a lab activity. So So we're sort of using that to guide how we define it and how we do the pre-work to set it up so that its barrier of entry is very manageable. Um, so Martin, Yvonne, uh, so Martin, our co-chair Martin, Yvonne from NASA Ames, Paul Mani from Collins Aerospace India, Brian Wood, and myself from the Boeing company are all collaborating on this in a weekly call. And that is definitely an area for collaboration if you're interested in learning about NASA's co-pilot formal verification approach. This is exactly what we're setting up here, is that framework. And if you want to learn about like how to containerize a scenario or uh, have interest in some of the test app development as we add more use cases, I think we're definitely open for collaboration on all those sort of things. So a lot of different areas you can contribute in this space. The team met last week in our working group call, and we brainstormed a little bit about topics we wanted to add to our list for this year. One was restarting the survey on state of the art that was worked on in 2023 and a little bit at the start of last year. It was focused more on like commercial aerospace topics. And the team brought up that adding a flight framework comparison, so adding a little bit of a space theme, would be interesting. Summarizing the papers, as well as NASA has some material that they'll be releasing soon that really be constructive in this space to add to that the survey. The other item that Tim Bird brought up was survey on satellite use of Linux, which I thought was super cool because there's been a lot of satellites launched, and there's a lot of off-the-shelf boards. So everything from like NVIDIA Jetsons to Raspberry Pis to random Android phone. So that's another area. So this sort of starts, getting a little bit of that space theme, and it also maybe gives us that opportunity to talk about, well, this safety standard for commercial aerospace versus this safety standard for NASA, and how do those relate? With which framework, with which satellites in orbit. So, yeah, I thought this was a really good idea and really helps maybe inform some of our use case focus too, which ones we pick for next steps. So we had a few people reach out and want to collaborate on this. We do have it set up in a way that we are welcoming whomever would like to join us or have ideas for additional focuses of this survey. We can get you access and engage you in the discussions. I think we'll have some calls separate from our working group call. So, so yeah, definitely reach out to me, hit the mailing list, open an issue ticket. I think we're flexible on how you'd want to engage, but this is an area we're looking for volunteers. Other items for 2025, something we're doing jointly with Space Grade Linux is working through establishing code repositories. Aerospace is doing this primarily for setting up examples and demos and sort of like incubator-like stuff. Space Grade Linux, I'll let them go into the depth of it. I think has some development scenarios they want to capture that may have more pieces to it, and both documentation and code. So we've been trying to approach it from, how can we get licensing and developer contributor approaches, clearly defined, and we can both use those for our needs. So the other thing we've been looking at is automation. So we've been working with the tools working group to get GitHub and GitLab approaches figured out for building the different examples and scenarios that we're creating. Last bullet there, I mentioned a little bit already that Safety Architecture Group did present on the Linux kernel requirements design, and the tools working group talked a little bit about tracing the whole thing. So this is an area that was discussed a little bit. That'd be interesting to make sure our use cases are informing, and I think maybe also learning a little bit. So first one here, this QR code will get you to our working group page. From that, you can also navigate to the Space Grade page if you're interested in theirs. I think Ramon will have links as well in his working group or a SIG discussion coming up. At that site, you can sign up for our mailing list as well as the monthly meetings. And if you don't find a good way to reach out to us, you can subscribe to that list, drop us a message. The other way would be with the link on the bottom. It's out to our GitHub project. You can open issue tickets there if you're trying to get in contact with us or you want to contribute, as well as that's where we store our meeting minutes if you're curious about this last year in detail. And the use case document drafts, that white paper on survey of state of the arts out there, and the code demos are in uh, pull requests right now. We got some of the initial documentation out there. So a lot of good stuff there. We're trying to keep our content right now in that space. So I think that is all I got. Questions wise, thank you, Matt Kelly, for clarifying the LLVM version. I was thinking it was it was 19 point something. So yeah. Those presentations on MCDC do have links to like the kernel patches and a lot of detail on observations of the output. Interesting to see what the coverage looks like. It's pretty low, and that was a very interesting conversation at Plumbers of just like, wow, if we can get this into kernel CI, it's just the statistics would be very telling and maybe help motivate on some of the testing aspects. So yeah. Any other questions?
There was a question in the Q&A part, which I answered. I
Okay.
believe it wasn't directly to the aerospace, but
Yeah, that
was a
mapping one is a good one.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess the question was around like if you could map different standards to each other and figure out like, okay, you're fulfilling a requirement of the standard, how does it relate or map to another standard, which is a typical question. And there has been an activity which has been recently discussed within the LISA, and we currently have deep dives on this as well. So there will be a next deep dive on it's called Standards Atlas. It was something which was started by Elisa, but brought into it by Sebastian Hetzer from Red Hat. So it's now currently residing under his repository. And this is basically using an LLVM to map different kind of standards and figure out where the overlap, where do you find repeating patterns and so on. So if you're interested in such a topic, you should be informed. We're in the process of scheduling another deep dive session, I guess.
From the last session, Sebastian and I worked through getting a information release request figured out that I did send to RTCA to request release of the 178, a series of the DO standards outlines, so we could add them to Standards Atlas and start to do that analysis activity. So I think we requested 178C, 278, which is like the IT standard, like data center backend on the ground standard. We requested 326A and 356A, which are the two security standards. They were created a lot from like the NIST 800 standards from the U.S. government for cybersecurity. So those four. So hopefully, if we get those, I think that'll be really interesting to map to the NASA standards, which are open, and we shared some information with Sebastian up. I haven't talked with Yvonne about this yet, but trying to connect some of the dots there because I think we should be able to this year tie functional safety to NASA to 178 if we're successful, which I think would be awesome.
We got another question from Bruce in the chat. Says there was a slide full of blocks early on that has Copilot in the upper right. Is that the Copilot DSL? I'm sure which
DSL.
slide.
I'm not sure the acronym, but it's NASA Copilot, which is it's a formal verification framework, can be both used for offline verification. Oh, thanks. Offline verification, but also used as like online monitors. So you can use it as a a flight fault management harness too. And I didn't do it justice. Their site has really good discussion. Um, so thank you, Bruce.
Okay. Guess.
So
Now we can stop the recording.